Greetings, everybody. Everybody seems to be in the Zoom meeting right now, and a big hello from us here in the Civil Society Unit in the UN Department of Global Communications, regardless of where you are connecting from. If you have time in the chat, kindly drop us a note and tell us where you're connecting from. We want to see just how global this communications event is going to go. It's really great to be here. It's always a pleasure for me to connect with our constituencies in civil society on these meetings, be it in person or virtual. I'm Hawa Diallo. I'm the chief of the Civil Society Unit here in the UN Department of Global Communications in New York City at the headquarters. Today we are gathered for our communications workshop. It's an annual session that we normally have, and I'm really proud and happy to be partnering with the Global NGO Executive Committee, GNEC, one of our longtime partners, to bring this awesome event to you. So for today's session, we have a great lineup of speakers who will be talking to you just how to communicate as an NGO, your messaging or messaging about the UN, or issues that are of concern to you that are aligned to global issues, but especially in times of conflict and humanitarian crisis. So I think that we have a great show lined up. And I think, our speakers who come from various parts of the UN and civil society have a lot of great tips, lessons learned, and best practices to share with you. So before we get started, just a bit of housekeeping rules. It is an interactive session, but we're asking that everybody, keeps their video off and that you stay muted. Our distinguished moderator will call on you when we have the question and answer period. And at that time, we will ask you to unmute yourself. So there's plenty of time for us to hear your valuable contributions, but just so we have an ease of flow, in terms of the speakers getting all this great information to you, we just ask that we keep these housekeeping rules. Social media is there, and we're going to be very hot on social media. We have our hashtag UN the Civil Society, and we'll put some other ones in the chat for you so that we can really take this communications networking event out of the virtual setting, but out there in the world. We're not streaming live today, but we will upload this post the event so that you can share this within your respective networks. Keep an eye on the chat. A lot of things are going to be happening there in terms of resources, and that's where we're going to ask you to put your questions for the Q&A. So enough for me. My job is easy today. Besides looking beautiful, and I hope you agree, my job is to sit back and to listen to all the great information that our speakers have. So now you sit back, relax, and enjoy the ride. I have the honor right now to pass the floor and invite my distinguished colleague and friend, Patrick Sharada, the chair of the Global NGO Executive Committee. Patrick, take it away.
Hey, thank you. And thank you all for joining us today. Thank you, Ms. Diallo, for your welcome and for always being the best friend to civil society and to the entire civil society community at the UN. We treasure you and your team. I've asked for a few extra minutes to stretch my introduction into a moment where I will add some specific tips for this workshop. I greet you as the president of the Global NGO Executive Committee. We are the representative NGO collaborating with UNDGC on this briefing. But I wonder if each of you know that we are who we are, rather, at GNEC. We're elected by nominations only from UNDGC already associated NGOs, and only those in good standing. So this briefing is very important to each of us on the board. For example, the lead person on our team working to make this presentation is Dr. Connie Sensor. She was nominated to the GNEC board by the League of Women Voters and also teaches at Rutgers University. Another speaker today is our colleague Olusabuma Aina, a leader herself of Light Up Foundation in England and Africa. and I was nominated by the World Development Foundation, where I'm a senior fellow. I also think this is a very special moment, as we are going to be hearing from United Nations staff, themselves experts in the field of communication during crisis. They may also reflect on how the UN works best alongside the most successful NGOs, communicating well with their teams and constituents during crises. Among our amazing guests, we're fortunate to have a UNESCO representative, Mr. Guy Berger. In fact, I invited UNESCO to join us today so they may encourage you to download their free workbook, Journalism, Fake News, and Disinformation, edited by UNESCO by Charlene Ireton and Julie Passetti. We'll put up that link for the free workbook at the end. Mr. Berger also helped prepare this important workbook. I believe that in his brief remarks, Mr. Berger will give an overview of the workbook and the emerging field of media information literacy. Hoping not to steal any of his thunder, I wanted to drill down on some particulars in 3 distinct sections of the book. I'm not a journalist, but through this important workbook, I've come to learn how to master this process. This is universally useful information for communicating during crisis or whenever facts need to come first, which is always for NGOs where our reputations are our only valuable commodity. Briefly then, NGOs communicating in crisis could benefit from better use of information, sharing fair and full information so their constituents can make sound choices. And investigation itself, investigating all aspects of the crisis, providing the best analysis for the constituent. The analysis itself, analyzing all the facts, providing a coherent framework for interpretation to help constituents comprehend a complex crisis. Social empathy, telling people about others in their society and their reactions so that they come to appreciate the viewpoints and choices others made in the face of this or a similar crisis. For NGOs to succeed in the online environment during a crisis, they must connect, curate, be relevant, be expert, be truthful. If fact-checking is important, certainly look for balance, accuracy, be human, show empathy, diversity, be constructive, be transparent, show your sources, be accountable, and allow for criticism. NGOs need to become more savvy in the digital arena when they are crisis sharing, but how? Well, let's look at some aspects brought up in the book. Inquisitiveness about a wide range of issues, concern to become and remain well-informed, alertness to opportunities to use critical thinking, trust in the process of reasoned inquiry, self-confidence in one's own abilities to reason, open-mindedness regarding divergent world views, and flexibility in considering alternatives and opinions, understanding of the opinions themselves of other people, recognizing and honestly facing one's own biases, prejudices, stereotypes, and egotistical tendencies, a prudence in suspending or making or altering judgments, and a willingness to reconsider and revise views after honest reflection when change is warranted. These issues raised in the workbook by UNESCO have helped me tremendously as an NGO leader to be able to better communicate in crisis, and I strongly urge you to follow up on this free source of excellent information. With that, I conclude my extended introduction, and I invite our keynote speakers to join us now with their general perspectives and in-depth looks at these issues. Connie, the floor is yours for the introductions. Thank you.
Sorry. Good morning, good afternoon, Good evening to my colleagues and friends around the world. And thank you to Hawa and Patrick for your wonderful opening remarks. I'm so excited about this communications workshop today, and I can tell that you are too by the large number of participants that we have. So welcome everyone. Every crisis or conflict will present its own unique challenges and will take unexpected twists and turns. So when a crisis emerges, there can be a great deal of confusion and misinformation that is shared in the media and by the public. Therefore, strategic communication helps to provide accurate, timely, and sensitive information and messages, which can address or prevent misinformation, provide leadership, and bring communities together. Ensuring that the right people receive the right messages at the right time from a trusted source can help combat eroding trust and encourage the positive rather than negative behaviors. Late in 2019, during the UN General Assembly, I had the pleasure to listen to Dr. Tedros from the World Health Organization, and he said, "We must fix the roof before the rain comes." And I think in that message, he was referencing Ebola, but forewarning of the possible pandemic. The message was to be prepared ahead of the conflict or crisis to mitigate confusion and misinformation. And often, dependable channels for communication collapse. So this workshop examines and provides tools to help NGOs communicate accurate and reliable information, especially in times of crisis and conflict. Our distinguished panelist speakers will share several ways of amplifying NGO messaging to support peace and humanitarian-oriented action. Many resources to supplement the briefing from our speakers today can be found at the Department of Global Communications Civil Society Unit website, which will be posted at the end of this program on the screen and in the chat. I want to remind you again, as Hawa said, to keep your videos off and remain muted until the question and answer section for our panelists after the speakers conclude. And you will hold your questions until the end, and then we'll take as many questions as we can that time allows, and some have been sent ahead, so we will also try to include as many as we can. You can post your questions in the chat, and when we call on you to ask your question, you can turn on your video and unmute to ask the question. So this concludes my remarks and guidelines for how we're going to continue with this program today. I will now, it's my great pleasure to introduce Mr. Guy Berger, Director of Strategies and Policies, Communications and Information from Unesco. Guy, you have the floor.
Thank you so much, and I trust you can hear me okay?
You can.
Oh, super. Let me start off by telling you at UNESCO we have a slogan which is think before you click. Think before you click. When I looked at the title of this workshop, Communication in Times of Conflict, How to be Seen and Heard, I thought I need to think before I click. And what I started thinking is, well, heard, seen and heard. Heard is how to be seen within the herd, because you know, there's a huge herd of content out there, and how you distinguishing yourself as one zebra amongst other zebras in the herd. And then I thought about how to be seen, and I thought, well, the name of the game today is visual more than textual. And then I thought scene is also about scene, S-C-E-N-E, like mise en scène. And so we're speaking about communications as a stage, as a performance, and that it's not just seeing, you know, without that component. It's about spectacle in some senses. So this really made me then wonder what it was that Patrick wanted me to say about this UNESCO book, which is, I don't know whether you see it okay, because I think I've got the blur on. Anyway, this book, which is a UNESCO book primarily for journalism educators, but not only, it is now in 30 languages, with 5 more languages coming. It has had 30,000 downloads and 160,000 views. So I think people do find it useful, and I'm certainly very pleased about it. And what I'm going to do now is give you a short quiz which draws on some of the points in this publication. And this short quiz also draws from our experience of the pandemic and what we have learned there about fake news, disinformation, and journalism. So please get a pen ready and write down your answer. Very simple 3 questions. And after asking the question, I'll give you the answer. First question, anti-vaccination, anti-vax. Is this kind of content about hate speech, or is it about disinformation? Hate speech or disinformation? Is it one or is it the other? Well, here's my answer, that I think anti-vax is primarily about disinformation. It doesn't have to go hand in hand with hate, because it in fact often goes hand in hand with love. And so what this points us to is that we can separate conceptually hate speech and disinformation, because we can find instances like anti-vax where they're not together. But when you turn to conflict, which is the subject here today, invariably you find these are fused, although they are also conceptually different. And the point of disinformation combined with hatred is that apparent facticity is used to give oomph to the emotion of hatred. Hatred by itself is just opinion, but hatred, when you combine it with falsehoods, gets that extra power. So I think we can understand then, when we're dealing with hatred in conflict situations, we need to look for this combo of the falsehoods and the emotion, and we have to tackle both, and they both require different dimensions. Okay, my second question to you, quiz question, is anti-vax content, is it disinformation or is it misinformation? Anti-vax, is it disinformation or is it misinformation? Now, I'm sure everybody on here will have heard the distinction that disinformation is intentional and misinformation is not intended to cause harm. So what is anti-vax? So my reading, informed by this UNESCO publication, is that it's actually both. And that very much of the misinformation is actually a function of echoing disinformation. That, as you may have heard, there's a group called the Dirty Dozen of disinformation people in the anti-vax community who make a lot of money out of selling vitamins, for example. There's also geopolitical forces that want to promote division and promote anti-vax. So they start with the disinformation, deliberate falsehoods. And of course, these take on a life of their own, and people start circulating them as misinformation. Now, the relevance to conflict of this is it's exactly the same thing. You have disinformation, and then it increasingly fuels misinformation. Now, again, you've got to look at these because they require different kinds of responses. Misinformation may be just a question of educating the public, but disinformation requires more stringent measures. And so disinformation, you've got to figure out, is this orchestrated? With what agenda? Are they trying to make money? Are they trying to cause mischief? What is the story, and what is the sanction or the commensurate response there? Okay, third and last question is, does one swallow make a summer? Does one swallow make a summer? And of course, the answer there is no. And this is because one falsehood, even when it's repeated, doesn't make for misinformation or disinformation, because the way communication and meaning works is narrative. Narrative is much wider than your atomized isolated tidbits of content. And so it's about, in a narrative, it's not purely falsehoods. There's often a mix of falsehoods and truths. And there's also a lot of narrative rhetoric and devices that goes into questioning truths as if it's just innocent. And there's also a lot of stuff which goes into taking undetermined truths and saying, this is definitely wrong or this is definitely false. Meantime, we don't know because the science hasn't got there or because the future still has to be made. Now, what this means, I think, then is that does one swallow make a summer? No, we have to look at the wider narratives to see what the season is. We have to look at the mix of birds. We have to look at which birds are strikingly visual, which birds are very noisy and chirpy, which birds are, you just read about in a textual description, because those also impact on narrative. And we also have to look at what are the swallows, what are the hawks, what are the ostriches, what are the chickens?
Or I guess go around him and talk to Tara, but you know.
Okay, I think somebody needs to mute themselves. Anyway, what I'm saying is that in the narrative, you have to look at the different kind of birds, sunbirds, swallows, hawks, and then you have to recognize that why we see these as birds is because there's a kind of a quality to them that makes up, that sums up birdness. In other words, we can distinguish a bird from a bat. And in the same way, a narrative makes sense because it's about what kind of human being are you? What are you responding to? Are you responding to anger? Are you responding to national identity, ethnic identity, gender identity, and so on? So to understand the narrative is to understand identity. And here, of course, in conflict, we know that conflict is about polarized identities. This is absolutely important. And I would just take my bird metaphor of narrative a bit further, because we have a situation here that those who are promoting hate and those who are promoting disinformation, they're not just happily coexisting, they are aggressive. You may be a lark, you may be a nightingale, but there are hawks out there, vultures, that can only exist if they attack you. In other words, this game that we're in, especially in conflict, there is aggression. And what that means is that if you're in the communications business on the other side, you've got to anticipate that your safety is at risk. And you have to anticipate that alliances are key. Alliances with those with the interest in truth-telling, fact checkers, good journalists. You have to figure out alliances with the social media so they don't amplify these attacks on you, as is tending to happen. And you've got to be very determined that, one, you will tell the truth because you have to document with evidence, particularly crimes that are committed in times of conflict. And you need to be anticipatory. You have to pre-bunk. You have to work with the social media to see what is coming down the pipeline in terms of hate, in terms of falsehoods. Because if you're trying to deal with it once it hits, it's too late. So pre-bunking is key. Finally, you need to, I think, not only focus on the falsehoods and play in that space, as important as it is, you also need to play in the emotional space, because human beings are not purely rational and mind-body dualist kind of animals. And what I'm just trying to say, you can't play exclusively in one space or the other. So I think that's what I wanted to just give you as input. And let me conclude with 3 final questions. I've tried to be a bit provocative here. I hope you can answer this question positively. Do you think you have more insight now into these issues than before this input? Yes or no? Or did you know it all? Second question, should you invest a bit of time in at least downloading this book and flicking through it? Yes or no? I'm sure Patrick will be happy, and so will UNESCO if you do look at it. And the third question is, if some of this input has given you ideas, and I really welcome discussion that will come, are these ideas that you can share to empower your constituency with what Patrick referred to as media and information literacy? Can you build the competency of your constituency so they understand when they engage in this environment of conflict that there are complicated questions about disinformation and misinformation. There are complicated issues of hate speech. There's issues of narrative. There's issues of identity, and that you need to anticipate that you getting involved in these spaces need to have protection and you need alliances. With that, back to you, Connie.
You're muted.
Thank you. Sorry, I'll get the technology down pat. Thank you, Guy, for that informative presentation. It was wonderful. It's now my great pleasure to introduce to you Mr. Lance Gould. He is the CEO of Brooklyn Story Lab. And Lance, you have the floor.
Thank you so much, Connie, for that wonderful introduction. It's a pleasure to be here. My name is Lance Gould, and as Connie said, I'm the CEO of Brooklyn Story Lab. I'm also on the advisory board of GNEC, and as a journalist at Huffington Post and a number of other places in the past, I have covered the UN for more than 30 years, including the original Earth Summit in Rio in 1992. Today, we're talking about crisis communications and how to get more visibility and impact for your organization in times of crisis. So I'm going to share a little slide here. Can you know if you can see this? Can everyone see?
Yes.
Okay.
Yes.
We're currently in one sec here. We're currently in what experts refer to as the decade of action. We have less than 10 years until we reach the year 2030, a deadline imposed by scientists who concluded that if humanity doesn't make dramatic changes to our ways of life by then, we may face irreversible consequences to our planetary home. It's a worrisome existential thought, and one that requires us all to take dramatic action. And it's a thought that screams out for good examples of what others are doing to take leadership in this arena. That opens the door for you or your organization to tell your story about the important work you're doing in these times of great crisis. And speaking of crises, we're currently facing an unprecedented confluence of crises, a climate emergency, an international pandemic, war and global conflict, guns and violence, and terribly unequal societies in which race and gender and religion play an outsized role in determining who are the haves and the have-nots. In other words, there is great pain and despair in the world, but there is also great comfort that comes from learning about how heroes are tackling these problematic issues. And that again creates an opportunity for you and your social good-minded organization or NGO. The best way to take advantage of that opportunity is to disseminate your message through storytelling. You can, of course, put out press releases, which are a reliable tool for what they call earned media coverage. Earned media is, in other words, reaching journalists who could cover your story. But at Brooklyn Story Lab, we teach purpose-driven organizations how to think and behave like media companies so that you can tell your own story too. Because all of the speakers here today and all of you on this call are, in that context, media companies. But not everyone has the skill set or the capacity to tell or amplify those stories. So today, in the 5 to 7 minutes that we have here, we'll give a few quick pointers on storytelling, from heroes to wizards to how the calendar can become your best friend. First, we'll start off with storytelling. Storytelling has a fairly reliable, easy to remember formula. It's one that has been tested over thousands of years, from pre-verbal societies, such as in cave paintings, to epic poem song cycles, such as the Iliad, to novels and movies. That formula is hero, conflict, resolution. That's it. That's the formula. That formula must also include a transformation in the hero to qualify as a story. In a traditional comedy, if you go back to Elizabethan times, a couple gets married. That's the resolution, or that's the transformation. In a traditional tragedy, someone dies. Adolescent becomes an adult. Rookie becomes veteran. Weakling becomes person of courage. If there's no transformation, it's just Wednesday. It's not really a story. So there has to be a transformation for it to qualify as a story. Many times in these stories, the hero will get some unsolicited assistance from a mystical figure. That mystical figure, we'll call them the wizard, will give cryptic advice to the hero, but won't drag the hero over the finish line. The hero must do that themselves. Think of Dumbledore in Harry Potter, or Mr. Miyagi in The Karate Kid, or Yoda in Star Wars. These mystical figures are giving advice, but they're not helping the hero get over the finish line. They're giving them the information that the hero needs him or herself to get over the finish line. So this is important because we're talking about wizards, but it seems like it might be off topic about crises, but this is important. Your organization in a story should never be the hero. When your organization is the hero, that story becomes PR. But when your organization is the wizard helping the hero over the finish line, then you have a story that will be of potential interest to content consumers, one that could go viral. So when you're looking at a crisis, whether it be the climate crisis or the gun crisis in the US, or the war in Eastern Europe, or the pandemic, think about the people in your ecosystems who are on the front lines, who are doing the heroic work to make things better, and focus on them. They are the heroes, not your organization. Your organization should be the wizard. Connecting to the SDGs. Everyone on this call should be familiar with the SDGs. For those who aren't, and I'm sure there probably are, but just in case, they are, of course, an international blueprint for sustainability to make sure that by 2030, no one on the planet gets left behind. The first 16 goals, as you all know, are each affiliated with a household name cause: education, health, poverty, climate. But the 17th goal, partnerships, is, in my estimation, recognition by the international community that the public sector alone will never be able to raise the trillions of dollars necessary every year to achieve the first 16 goals. So in that sense, SDG 17 is an olive branch from governments to the private sector and to civil society. Help us get the word out. And by connecting to this international framework for social good, your organization can get 1, more visibility, and 2, more impact. Those are the 2 qualities exactly that we're talking about for this seminar today: how to be seen and heard, how to get more visibility and more impact. So at Brooklyn Story Lab, SDG 17 is our North Star and is our guiding principle. We partner with for-profits and nonprofits as long as the work in question is related to social good or helping to ensure that in some way no one on the planet is left behind. There aren't SDGs related to sectors where there are no problems. All of the SDGs in some way help to address the world's most pressing problems, the kind that, when exacerbated or ignored, become crises. So in some way, when you're working to help advance the SDGs, you're prophylactically helping to solve crises. And that is a really good way to frame the stories that you're telling about your own organization. Lastly, we're going to talk about the editorial calendar. The editorial calendar is a date-based agenda for action to which most journalists and organizations pay requisite attention. Social media platforms like Twitter and Facebook, from which a lot of people get their news, use algorithms to determine what stories are trending at a particular moment. Note that these trending stories count as trending because they are getting unusual attention at a particular time. It's not about what is getting the most usage. If trending status was determined simply by topics or keywords that were getting the most usage, it might be all Taylor Swift or BTS, the K-pop band, or Justin Bieber all the time. Instead, it's actually about which topics or keywords are getting particular usage at that moment, algorithmically different from the day before or the day after. So it's actually possible to predict to some degree what topics will be trending on social media and capture some of the audience that is hungrily searching for content, a particular topic on a given day, by using the editorial calendar to predict what will happen. So if you know that, for example, well, here I'll go into the 4 different types of buckets that contribute to the editorial calendar. There are 4 essential buckets in the editorial calendar: social awareness days, such as World Ocean Day or Earth Day or National Breast Cancer Awareness Month; tentpole events, such as the UN Ocean Conference that's taking place right now in Lisbon, or UNGA, which is coming up in September, or COP27 in Egypt in November, or Davos next year in January; landmark anniversaries. In 2020, it was the 50th anniversary of Earth Day, it was the 50th anniversary of Davos, it was the 75th anniversary of the UN. So landmark anniversaries are a good way to, and even for social justice moments, like a year after some terrible incident, you can revisit that with with content about that particular topic. And then lastly, of course, you have breaking news, which is a little harder to predict. This month would be gun violence in Uvalde, or the Supreme Court decision to overturn Roe v. Wade. But a lot of times when you know that gun violence comes up again and again, unfortunately, or when you know that there's going to be a decision made about Roe v. Wade, you can prepare content in advance that can be utilized when those topics arise. Social awareness days are designed to call attention to global problems. So they're a great way to connect the important work that you're doing with an audience that has specific curiosity about it and that are practically guaranteed to trend. So if you study the month ahead to know precisely when social awareness days will occur, many of which have tangential connections to crises, from ocean health to malaria to matters related to social justice, you can create content in advance that will be ready to connect with audiences on that day. Same with tentpole events, Davos, UNGA, COP27, all of these kinds of events. Those events are intended to address issues around which organizations like yours, like the NGO that you work for, are doing critically important work. And with breaking news, depending on what your organization does, as I was just saying a few seconds ago, it should be relatively easy to find staff or others who are doing the important work that addresses the issues that have flared up because of a crisis. It could be that your organization feeds the hungry or fights for climate justice or works to level the playing field with regards to gender equality. In each of these instances, a crisis is an opportunity to showcase that important work and raise your visibility and deliver more impact. Again, those are the two critical things we're talking about today, visibility and impact. So here's the conclusion. In a crisis, good editors at media companies will actively look to assign stories to reporters about heroes and victims. By being in charge of your own media company, you can create content that reaches news consumers directly, particularly in times of crisis, when natural human interest in such a story peaks. And lastly, note that in times of crisis, the power of social good can be a feel-good elixir to help combat the oppressively negative storylines out there. So a story about the good work someone in your organization is doing to combat the negative impact of a crisis can provide joy and hope to readers dumbstruck by an awful situation, and even be a sought-after shareable asset that makes them feel better to both read and pass along. So happy to take questions at the end of this, but thank you so much for listening and really appreciate your time today.
Thank you, Lance. That was wonderful. I'm sure there'll be a lot of questions generated at the end of the presentation. It is now my great pleasure to introduce Mr. Ratnamir Petrovic, the Chief of Radio for the UN mission to South Sudan.
Thank you very much, Connie, and good morning to all of you in New York, or good afternoon to people who are more like closer to this part of the world, which is Africa and Europe. And it's a great honor and pleasure to address you all. So what I can say, so I've been chief of Radio Miraya, which is the United Nations missions in South Sudan's radio for the last 6.5 years. And accidentally, and it's a great joy as well, and to share with you that today we celebrated our 16th birthday. So Radio Miraya has been here since basically the 30th of June 2006. We've been going through different cycles, different experiences. Initially, the government, because the Radio Miraya was founded and the mission was established back in the days when Sudan was one country. And I think that we played a pivotal role in helping South Sudan gaining their independence, which happened eventually in 2011. And unfortunately, since then, the situation's been very volatile. So first of all, in 2013, 2014, we had a first sort of armed conflict within South Sudan. Then later on, the peace agreement was signed, and the sort of parties, warring parties and parties in conflict were brought and encouraged to work together. So in 2016, they tried again to form the government and transitional government and to try to work together. Unfortunately, around this time, in just before the Independence Day, which is the 9th of July, It was in 2016, so the new violence erupted, leading to another, initially like 4 to 5 months of really tense situation and really, how would they put it, like a very like difficult and strong conflict. Later on, the situation improved, but still another peace agreement was signed, and now we have a government, transitional government, that's working together. Unfortunately, we're slightly behind the schedule. So according to the peace agreement, the election should be held the latest in December this year, with all the like institutions being formed by March next year. However, before the electoral process is done, and I have to say this is the first time that we have this situation, and so we never had elections in South Sudan. So the census has to be done, voter registration has to be done, and also after that, after the registration, and as part of the registration, we have to do the voter education, and then the very elections should have to take place, and after that the institution should be formed. So somehow still nobody's basically coming with a solution or actually suggestion that the whole process should be extended, but it seems that this is what's going to happen, because the time is getting like shorter, and it seems that there is not enough time for the process to be done properly. Also, we are in the midst of the rainy seasons, which is not really helping. So 16 years of Miraya in a country that basically since 1955, which was the time when Sudan gained independence from Britain, has been like this like cyclic like phases of violence. So it is quite difficult, and somehow now only hearing you and hearing other colleagues, because somehow we are very much isolated and very much like inward looking. So we think that only the crisis in South Sudan is basically the crisis and the conflict that's happening. But unfortunately, it seems that we have more and more conflicts around the world. Of course, conflicts are leading to, again, instability, and people are suffering. So we have the population of 12 million people, but the estimation, because as I said, the census is not done, the estimation is that more than 3 million people are currently outside of South Sudan. So we have something like between 8 and 9 million people in the country. Out of that, the international community with the partners and donors have been providing humanitarian aid for more than 6 million people. So now we can expect a new conflict, which is like, because basically the donors and the international community, there is a certain fatigue and there are no resources, and it's very difficult to attract donors and get like more resources to provide humanitarian aid. So basically WFP and UNHCR, they already said that they're going to cut the humanitarian assistance provided. I'm sure that this is going to lead to additional conflict. Also, as the chief, our SRSG, the chief of UNMIS, Nicholas Asen, today said in the press conference that we have a climate change as another trigger of conflict. And we are really, like, for the last couple of years, it's very visible. So like you can see, so the whole pattern of like the rainy season and dry season is changing. So there is a lot of, like, I mean, the cattle keepers who are migrating over South Sudan over the year, like during the year, everything is getting worse, because it's either there is too little water, or there is too much water, with basically grazing land being covered with flooding water. So again, I'll stop here, and I'm more like how would I say, like from your end, it seems that you're more like into theory based on a lot of experience, and I'm here at the moment witnessing that like firsthand. So if you have any questions, I'm here to answer them. And basically, I think that we as the radio, we've been playing a very pivotal and crucial role, because in a way, in a country where other means and other sources, like, I mean, social media do exist, but it's very limited. And one thing is like the lack of internet. Another problem is that even if there is the internet, people can't afford it, because just to put everything in the context, so let's say average teacher salary is something like $20 per month. On the other hand, if we were not, and as Lance mentioned, so it's about us being heroes and wizards and trying to address the situation and to find a solution. So if we didn't believe that it's possible, we probably wouldn't be here. So I would finish with another colleague who basically said we are working at 3 P's. So the first P required is peace, and the second one is prosperity. Actually, sorry, the second one is progress, and the third one is prosperity. And all of this takes time, but we're hopeful that we can assist the people of South Sudan to eventually get there. So yeah, thank you very much. Good luck, and I'm here for your questions.
Thank you so much, Ratnamir. I think that it was very important to add the perspective of a developing country and remind us that the internet and social media are not widely available throughout the world, and there are alternative means of communication that are very valuable and important. So thank you, and I'm sure there will be questions for you at the end of the session. I would now like to introduce to you Julia Hagel. She's the manager, outreach program on the 1994 genocide against the Tutsi in Rwanda, Strategic Communications Division, Development and Human Rights Section, Department of Global Communications. And welcome, Julia.
Great. Thank you very much, Connie, and thank you very much, colleagues, and everyone who has made these inspiring remarks. Yes, I apologize for my background. Somehow Zoom didn't let me put on the nice background that was created for me. But yes, as I said, I work in the UN in the Department for Global Communications, and in addition to managing the outreach program on the 1994 genocide against the Tutsi in Rwanda, I'm also the focal point on the larger human rights issues. And one of the things that I would like to talk to you about today is the focus on the No to Hate campaign that we have started in DGC. And perhaps this is going to give you a bit of a sort of some tools that we hope you will use in the work that you do, and the important role that civil society organizations play. I mean, as Guy Berger from Unesco has mentioned, the issue of this misinformation and hate speech. I mean, they really are interlinked, and in recognition of this growing problem of all of those three. Now, with the focus that I'm speaking on hate speech, the Secretary General actually in 2019 launched the United Nations Strategy and Plan of Action on Hate Speech. This was a reflection of the observance that hate speech is rising around the world. It is something that expresses itself in very different iterations. And I think, South Sudan that we've just heard is a very, is an example of something like this taking root. I've just returned, our Undersecretary General for Global Communications just did a mission. I accompanied her on to Bosnia and Herzegovina, where hate speech is really a driving factor of separating communities, of threatening the peace agreements that were reached in Dayton following the Balkan Wars. And this is also something that is driven, sadly. I think this is something that also civil society has to contend with, that the civil society space as hate speech rises often is increasingly restricted, as also Lance said, you have to prepare yourself, I think, for also being, proactive. As Guy had said, this is a space that is full, sadly, of aggression and of targeting, and that is also something that we experienced when we visited Bosnia and Herzegovina as an example, where also the UN looked at and said, okay, this is a situation, the mission that we went on from the global communications perspective was following up on missions by the Special Advisor on the Prevention of Genocide, as well as also aligned with the High Commissioner for Human Rights, who went there because of the country team there on the ground, sort of ringing the alarm bell, saying hate speech together with mis and disinformation is escalating. There are, when they look at the situation of a country, there's sort of steps that are almost like ticked off in terms of, what is happening and how high is the threat of this hate speech really leading into real life violence. And that was the case there. So when we talk about communicating in crisis, this is also what we are looking at, is sort of, when we have that feedback from the ground, what can we do from a communications perspective? And we are working on developing that. I think for Bosnia and Herzegovina will be sort of a test case that will then hopefully be used for other countries in that situation. But one of the key findings that have already been voiced by UN senior leadership is that one of the main tasks that the UN has to do, and I think UNESCO also, not to speak for them, but we had very close meetings with the colleagues on the ground there, is also to support civil society, to support independent media, to create spaces and support for these voices of good to counter this deluge of hate and mis and disinformation, and these often very targeted attacks on the institutions, on civil society institutions, on independent media organizations at the organizational level, but also as civil society actors, as well as independent journalists, particularly being targeted by hate. And if you dig a bit lower, if you're a woman in that field, then you get sort of an amplified and intersectional issue of being addressed with a very specific gender-based hate. So this is definitely something, if we want to communicate in crisis, and I think from the UN, this is one of the conclusions we have, is that we have to provide support and create that space to counter the hate-filled narratives that do exist on that. And there was our Undersecretary General had many meetings with civil society actors there, from youth organizations to as I said, journalism organizations, media organizations, ombudsmen, organizations to hear from them, to learn from them, but also then to be able to develop a strategy to support that in a situation that is crisis, not in its violent crisis, but to hopefully stop that, as sort of, I think also Guy said, sort of and that's not the word used, but sort of to preempt, right? Not to wait for something to break out, because once something has broken out, obviously it's so much harder to fight and to fix that, but to be proactive in that. Going back to the larger work on hate speech, what I would like to share with you particularly is this campaign that we have set up. This is, as I said, in response to the Secretary General's launch of the UN strategy and plan of action on hate speech, where we as communicators were tasked with, how can we support this? This is something that the whole UN system has been tasked to implement, to sort of look how we as the UN, together with civil society partners, also with government partners, what can we do to address this? And as global communications, our work obviously focuses on that part. So the thinking came, okay, this is, we will do a hate speech campaign under the hashtag No to Hate. So perhaps if we could move to the next, you'll see the visual identity that we have developed. And as you see sort of these speech bubbles, they symbolize, I think they've been kind of become, recognizable as hate speech, but also with the colors and the shape to sort of say, this is something that is pervasive, but also has, iterations that are clearly, insidious and yes, infiltrating our societies. Sort of the, sort of the target that we have was the Secretary General's quote that you just saw, that hate speech affects everyone. So it is something, it's all of our duties to address that. So that's really the overarching narrative of this campaign. a little of the background I've mentioned, there's the strategy and plan of action that really is the first time that brings sort of the whole UN system in a call to action to address this systematically together with our partners. There was just, Lance mentioned key dates. We just had on the 18th of June, the first International Day for Countering Hate Speech. So there also has been a recognition from the UN member state side that hate speech is something that is a real threat to societies, to democratic principles. And of course, the political perceptions of that come into play. But there was an agreement, or there was the General Assembly agreed to have the International Day for Countering Hate Speech declared, which was marked on the 18th of June. If you're wondering why 18th of June, this was the day the strategy and plan of action was launched by the Secretary General in 2019. So this was obviously a key moment around which we had built this campaign, but it is something as the issue continues to go on, this is going to be an ongoing campaign as well. And also in the communications priorities, for the UN, disinformation and hate speech were identified as one of the key pillars. So that obviously gave us an additional, push on that. If you could move to the next slide. Yes. Background, I mean, what we want to communicate, and I think hopefully that's also helpful for you, is to make people and the constituencies realize that, hate speech causes real harm. It is not just words, but words actually can be, and that we'll see some of the assets, can be weapons, right? Online words can lead to real world harm. And even if it's, hate speech is not always illegal as per the international human rights laws, but it's always hurtful and it's always damaging. So to highlight that, we also, and again, sort of nodding back to UNESCO, what is something that is important is that freedom of expression and opinion is a fundamentally human right. This is something that UN always advocates for. So we cannot use censorship, cannot be used as a way of suppressing hate speech. So we have to always keep that in mind, because sometimes, as we have seen, that is being used by some actors to justify censorship, to say that this is tagged hate speech or any kind of perhaps political discourse that does not go in line with some of the main narratives is tagged as that. Education, again, this is something that we want to digital literacy, but also education of what hate speech is really the key element of resiliency to stand up to hate speech. And what we want to then engage people on is collective action, to raise the awareness that this is, as I said, the responsibility for all of us, that standing back and silence is not an option. So this is where the campaign is driving to. If we could move to the next slide, please. So there you will see some of the assets. So what we have and what we hope that will be useful for you, all of these are available on a Trello board, which is this digital, it's a free software where you can place, some of you might be familiar with that, where you can place assets. And all of the assets that have been developed are editable by this Canva webs. Maybe I'm getting a little too technical, but basically, if you have someone in your organization that work on social media, all of the assets that have been developed are free to use. They're not branded UN, they're in support of the campaign. We do, and we hope by having this sort of suite of assets, because I know we are all at the UN, but I think in your organizations even more. So we're all stressed with resources. There is more that we would like to do, that we have capacity to do. And we do hope that since we have this suite of assets focusing on this issue of hate speech and on mis and disinformation, you could find those useful for your own channels, and you're very welcome to use them, to translate them, to adapt them. They're already assets in, I think now 12 languages. So it's the official UN languages plus Kiswahili, Portuguese, and Hindi, and there also have been translations into other languages. So please do. This is one of the links that will be shared on there. Please do use those access. Take a look and use them to amplify and support the work that you do in countering this. You will see there's a suite of assets. There's some animations. There's educational aspects. If you could move to the next one, please. This is a sample. Again, those are some of the ones, if you followed your main accounts, you probably have seen those, since we had a big push in the lead up to the International Day for Countering Hate Speech. Again, this is some of the messaging that under the No to Hate slogan, we would invite you to use as you address this issue, as you face that with your own audiences. And as this is a rolling campaign, we will continue to develop new assets. So please do go checking back. Yes, we can move to the next one. Thank you. Another resource that we hope can help you on this is this portal that was developed. It's just digital portal, hate speech at United Nations. This was done because we realized, well, there is so many right now. There is a working group on hate speech at the United Nations, which by now has 24 UN agencies as members. The Office of the Secretary General's Envoy on the Prevention of Genocide is in the lead on that. But it shows, how impactful and how important this issue is across the UN system. So what we have developed is sort of an entry point into also, and I hope again that will be useful for your work. It provides information, what is hate speech, what is not hate speech, what is the UN doing on this. There are links to educational resources, a quiz you can take. So this is also a way of amplifying and engaging your audience with ready-made content that you are very welcome to use. And again, right now it's only available in English. We're working on translations. I think there's some French content already, but also again, hopefully this will be a reference point, and also it's an entry point into the work the UN system does as a whole. So you will find links to, again, UNESCO. We're working closely with colleagues there on this, both from the freedom of expression angle as well as the education angle, to amplify and use some of the great assets that UNESCO has developed, one of which was presented today. But also if you look at OHCHR from the human rights aspect, UNFPA from the gendered sort of women and girls reproductive rights aspect. So there are, you can drill down depending on the work your organization does. You will find links to more specific areas of focus around the issue of hate speech being done across the UN system. And again, just to caution, this is something, it is a work in progress, but there's a lot of content there already, but we will continue to build this out. Next slide, please, if we still have one, or was this the end? I think this is the end. Yes. Thank you very much. What I had there, and I'd actually taken it out, and I should have perhaps left it, is because there was reference that Lance did on the editorial calendar. We also have, of course, a campaign calendar. As I said, this is something that is ongoing. So around key dates and events of the UN, we will again raise awareness and push out campaign assets. For example, at the end of, in the mid-August, we have the International Day for Indigenous People, since they are particular targets of hate as we've identified them. We're working on content that looks at this. Before, actually, we do have a positive on the 18th of July date, which is Nelson Mandela International Day. So while we mark and celebrate Madiba as an icon, we also want to, as related to the day, sort of tease out the role that he has played as a champion of standing up to hate and highlight like his iconic role in that. So there is, as we look at the UN calendar, we've identified key moments where we again highlight that, and that is definitely, as Lance said, something where there is already momentum around to also encourage you to do that. There are the UN International Days that everyone can access, but also all the other moments that he has pointed out to encourage you to kind of think of that and kind of maybe, we jump on the bandwagon or amplify this where there's already interest, and then also algorithmic, I suppose, promotion of those things. So that is it from me. Thank you so much. And please do use our resources, and we hope they're useful to you. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Julia, for the valuable information that you just provided to us. And now my pleasure to introduce our final speaker, and then we'll open for questions and answers. And it's Miss Ola Subome Inla Aina, and she's the Executive Director of the Light Up Foundation and Director on the Global NGO Executive Committee. Ola, you have the floor.
Yeah, thank you very much, Connie, and my colleagues on board. Good day, distinguished panelists and audience. I feel privileged and grateful to be called upon to share some of Light Up's foundation approach that has assisted in the successful delivery of our services. Hopefully, this will help enlighten other civil society organizations on how to communicate more effectively during crises. Here, I will be handling from Light Up Foundation's perspective. That's how we handle communications during crises. The civil society plays a very significant role during period of crisis. They provide the much needed leadership to guide and move the community forward through the most difficult times. Sadly, in recent times, our world has experienced a myriad of sudden, intense, and complicated crises. This has caught most governments underprepared and in some cases completely unaware. Therefore, adequate measures to mitigate such crises were not put in place. This was the case with COVID-19, the Russia war in Ukraine, climate change, the earthquake in Ecuador, to mention but a few. As the Executive Director for Light Up Foundation, an organization with international remit, we work with young people and the disadvantaged, especially at the most challenging period of their lives. Today, I will be sharing with you 6 approaches that has proven very successful in the delivery of our services. 1, act fast despite limited information. So far from our field work and decades of experience, we have learned to act even when we lack adequate information. You wonder why? We move with the information we have. Admitting that you don't have answers to some questions doesn't indicate that you don't know what you're doing. While it is natural to desire more information, swift response in crisis situation will no doubt lead you to more information on the possible way forward. For us, acting fast has always led us to a pool of information required to manage the crisis even better. Inaction indicates zero leadership and creates fear and feeling of apprehension and confusion. For example, at the start of the Ukraine war, my organization, Light Up Foundation, traveled down to Ukraine to evacuate vulnerable orphans. We started off with information we got from the news. We didn't know the location of the orphans, and there was also language barrier here. Nevertheless, we traveled down to Ukraine writing on signboards to introduce who we are and our mission. We had to trace the location of these orphans by word of mouth and by sending continuous WhatsApp messages to various available contacts. Orphans hiding on the ground began to contact us, shouting, "Light up, help, light up, help," to call for assistance. So we had to supply them with relevant information and fund buses to aid their evacuation to a safer place. Here, we rose from the little information to become a major source of information to those around. Secondly, I'll be talking about transparency. Always update your team and service users with new and relevant information. Remember, badly managed information leaves a vacuum which only rumors and speculations will fill. When speculations takes over, problem becomes more difficult to resolve. Here, clarity and certainty are very important because they engender trust. If you have limited knowledge, be humble enough to own up to it. Note that your honesty creates psychological safety for the people you're working with. Another example here that I would give is in our mission, during our mission in Light Up Foundation, to take up during the Ukraine war. We were to assist the refugee of color in Poland, Slovakia, Hungary, Germany, and Romania. Specifically in Hungary, funds were needed for refugees' welfare. We had to own up that we did not have the funds. We later raised thousands of euros for them via media publicity. In another case, we had some of the students who left Ukraine, kept asking us which country they should go to. In being transparent, we informed them that we didn't know which country was best. We only encourage relocation to the nearest safe location. The third one, containment of information. We had to discreetly manage all the information we got. We were able to control the information we had access to, carefully sieving out speculations, and identify who has the responsibility to manage communication within our team. 4, the use of technology. Information currency is the energy with which communication thrives, and technology is at the heart of all this. We mostly relied on social media and emails to communicate quickly and effectively. We also made efforts to become familiar with existing regulations at our different locations to avoid frictions. Number 5, we had to power share. What do I mean by this? According to Hemi Edmondson, our instincts are to hold even more tightly to control in times of upheaval, but it backfires. Sharing information with the people around is empowering. This requires freely opening up to ask for help when you need help. It is clear your communication to the people around. Make sure you are clear in your communication with the people around you, that you cannot walk alone and you need their help. Sincerely, there is nothing worse than feeling helpless during a crisis situation. In using this approach, Light Up had to employ Ukrainian interpreters due to our language barrier. Finally, we had to establish value. During a crisis situation, goals and other factors may change, but it is always important to have a core value, which must be communicated to everyone in your team right from the beginning of the exercise. Light Up core value for Ukraine mission was the health and safety of Ukrainian orphans. So all our actions were in alignment with our core value, which we communicated clearly and often. Indeed, humans are social beings, but then our interaction with one another needs always to be regulated by truth, honesty, and consideration. When these qualities are lacking in communication, information dissemination will ironically create a fresh crisis, which is completely different from the original one you're trying to resolve. In conclusion, getting everyone on board with communication action is a very difficult task in times of crisis. That is the honest truth. Luckily, with an established corporate culture and the use of technology, civil society organizations can learn flexibility and be able to adapt to uncertainties and emergencies when the call arises. I hope you've been able to gather some points from all that I've communicated here today. Once again, thank you very much for listening.
Ola, thank you so much. And now is the place that we've all been waiting for the engagement and interaction with the participants. So you can post your questions in the chat and we'll try to get to as many as possible. The first question comes from Andy Vermoed in Belgium, and he's from the World Council for Public Diplomacy and Community Dialogue, post-URSA. And he's asking the panel to address the cultural aspects of communication in times of crisis, such as a valuable lesson in cultural awareness and cultural differences in communication. And I think that the question is best addressed to Guy and Julia. So if you could be brief in your answers so we can get as many questions on board as possible, but it's up to you to answer the questions now. Thank you.
And then perhaps I'd like to defer to Guy first and then add some some thoughts, unless he prefers the other way around.
Is it possible, Constance, to repeat, if you don't mind? Is it the
Sure.
multilingualism question?
The question asks if you can address the cultural aspects of communication in times of crisis,
Right.
such as a valuable lesson in cultural awareness and cultural differences in communication.
Yes. So I think my presentation, I really tried to pinpoint that issues of narrative are very much linked to issues of identity. And of course, identity is partially cultural identity. It's also gender identity. It's occupational identity, ethnic, linguistic, and so on. But cultural is of course, very important. And I think if one is not sensitive to that, then one is going to have inappropriate interventions. Just very quickly, UNESCO worked recently with the NGO Article 19 to look at what is happening at the moderation of social media platforms in Kenya, Bosnia and Herzegovina, and Indonesia, and especially at this issue about how sensitive are the content moderators of the social media in those countries to local cultural questions. That includes the kind of jargon there is, the sensitivities that there are, and their ability to understand, of course, the languages that often go hand in hand with culture. And it was found from this research, and I commend this to everybody, if you look at Article 19's website, it's published there, it was found that unfortunately, the big technology companies are really lacking in their intercultural competencies and their capacities and their personnel on the ground who play such an important role, either in throwing more fuel on the fire or in being able to cast light rather than heat. Thank you.
Thank you.
Mm-hmm. Thank you very much, Guy. If I may ask, yes, I would absolutely agree on that. And I think one issue that we have found, and I think the same goes with this misinformation, hate speech, and also particularly in times of crises, that culture is incredibly important, and issues really are very, very localized. While hate speech is a global problem, you really need insights and resources, as Guy had said, when you look especially in the social media space, to first of all, understand what the cultural sensitivities are. There are also sort of these terms and dog whistles that are used. So it's terms that are not necessarily understandable if you are not in that space. They also evolve very quickly because there are, as much as there is not enough moderation, there is moderation. And so as posts are getting taken down, or some of hashtags are being flagged, this is a space in the hate space and disinformation. It's a very engaged, unfortunately, audience. So they will move on. They use different codes. They start using images that are sort of signifying. So I think that whole to get that understanding, and for NGOs to be able to disseminate that and to distinguish what's going on is really, really important. It is a question of resources. I mean, these three countries that Guy was just referencing to, there are also issues of elections coming up, and I mean crises/elections where we know that there's an upsurge. So we also from the UN, we're working with social media companies to really also in a way hold them to account and to encourage them to really say, what are your plans for this? There's a crisis in the making. We know there's going to be an onslaught of hate speech that could lead to real life violence. I mean, two of the countries that Guy mentioned, and I'm not sure about Indonesia, but I know both in Bosnia and Herzegovina and Kenya, actually Kenya before, elections are coming up. And we have seen that this, hate speech is a key driver in that area. What are you doing as social media companies to have the staff, to have the resources also in terms of language and cultural understanding on the ground? So yes, that is an absolute key, and it's been, I think, a stumbling block as we look across crises around the world. I mean, what had happened in Myanmar, what is happening still in Ethiopia, and there is just the need of increasing cultural understanding and, frankly, resources to be able to monitor and counter this. Thank you.
Thank you so much. The next question comes from Janet Palafox from IBVM. Janet, if you're with us, can you please turn on your video and ask your question?
Hi. Good morning, everyone. I'm just really interested, and sorry, thank you for this workshop. It really is very helpful and assists us in the work that we're doing. One of my concern really is in relation to the so-called bots. Now, I'm not a technological person, but I'm very much aware that it has been used extensively, particularly in the lead up to elections when politicians are trying to change the narrative or change the historical narrative. And people then are sharing this, particularly in countries where Facebook and other social media is the main source of news for the people. So my question is, how do we as NGOs with limited financial financial strength to fight these well-sourced bots? How can we then work against this, or how can we engage or support our network on the ground in relation to trying to address misinformation and disinformation through social media? Thank you.
Perhaps Lance, you want to take this question?
Sure. Thank you for the great question. I think when I was referring to topics that trend on social media, I saw this. I think I saw this question in the chat as well. What I was referring to algorithms, I was talking about how there are certain hashtags that will trend, or keywords that will trend on social media, because there is a certain amount of awareness around those hashtags. For example, we know that World Oceans Day is going to trend on June 8th. We know that Earth Day is going to trend on April 22nd, because there's not a lot of mention of Earth Day on April 18th, for example, and suddenly on April 22nd, there's a multitude of utilization of that keyword or that hashtag that day. And so, whereas there might be a lot of mentions of Justin Bieber or Donald Trump or Vladimir Putin or whatever the topic might be on a particular day, on any day, the reason that a lot of these other hashtags trend is because they're getting a lot of attention at that particular moment. So that's how I was saying you can navigate and predict what will be trending on a given day by looking ahead on the calendar. Now, when you're talking about combating bots, that's an altogether different topic and a very good question. I would say that one thing to do is to utilize the same hashtag that they're using. When they're getting a lot of momentum, a lot of times you'll see something trend on Twitter, and I'm not going to take sides politically, but you might see something about Trump or something about Biden trending in the US, for example. And a lot of times it will be a negative, and then supporters of those two individuals will use that same hashtag to put their positive message out. So sometimes you can jujitsu and use the momentum of your opponent and try to put your own message out there by using that same hashtag. For whatever it's worth, people who are scrolling through that hashtag will see your response. But yes, you're right. I mean, when it comes to well-funded bots, it's very difficult to combat them. The only way to do them, the only way to try is to try to beat them at their own game and use whatever hashtag they're using to put your own message out and let that speak for itself.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Yes, we have a question from Luisa Gaucher from the Greens organization in Brazil. Luisa, are you with us? And if you are, can you turn on your video and ask your question, please? Okay, I am going to ask Luisa's question, and I'm going to direct it to Ratnamir. So Luisa asks, Nowadays, around the world, besides international conflicts, there are multiple internal conflicts and vulnerable scenarios posing a risk to the lives of many people, including children. How can NGOs work not only to communicate in times of conflict, but to really inspire a true movement for change inside national borders, advocating for peace and all the steps needed to achieve it, such as food security, economic security, and environmental security? And I know, Ratnamir, you had spoken to this in your presentation, but maybe you can address it again. Would you like me to repeat the question?
Nini, thank you for the question. Maybe you can repeat once again, but yeah, how much time do you have? Like a couple of hours or?
Yeah. Basically, she wants to know, how can NGOs work not only to communicate in times of conflict, but to really inspire a true movement for change inside national borders, advocating for peace and all of the steps needed to achieve it, such as food security, economic security, and environmental security? It's a big question.
Yeah, thank you so much. It's a massive question, and I think we can probably all contribute to this and spend another couple of days just discussing it, and not just like in referring to South Sudan, but basically the world in general. So how, I mean, first of all, I'm a broadcast journalist, and I've been doing this since 1994, and in a context of United Nations peacekeeping since basically 1999. So my expertise doesn't really lay in like the NGO sector. So maybe it could be, I mean, my role, and this is what I try to convey and to capture, is more like assisting NGOs and assisting all other players, including the UN as a peacekeeping, and not just that, but UN agencies and other humanitarian actors, let's say from OCHA, UNHCR, WFP, and further on. So probably this question should go to somebody else. I can sort of, based on my experience, can sort of deliberate on that, but I'm quite sure that there are colleagues who are much more involved and who would be much better to suitable and in a much better position to answer this question. So if this is okay.
Connie and Ratnamir, if I could just jump in a second, answering actually another question and this, looking at the aspect of cultural information that was raised earlier, I think we tended to answer that in a very linear way, and often cultural issues are not linear. They are really the basis of how we form our aggregate society. And I would say the answer to both of these issues, broadly speaking, is collaboration. More than even resources. I have been part of many projects in the developing world where the culture was as much of the situation as the question itself. And I've always found that collaborating with like-minded arts groups, we were thinking about bringing on the Bond Street Theater here to be part of this. They do this, in fact. The Bond Street Theater brings its kind of conflict resolution message into conflict situations and then works with local people to develop theater that reflects the local culture in relationship to the crisis issue that they're dealing with. So I would say it's always about collaboration. And if you're not familiar with the ground, one of the best organizations that you could find to collaborate would be a like-minded arts institution, because we often leave them out of the picture and they're often very central to what culture is. And lastly, then, about this very large issue, we're talking about communicating in crisis, but if you really want to look at the area of how to inspire within these realms, again, the answer is collaboration. The more we come together, we are stronger in civil society. The more we come together with the United Nations, we are stronger. And the more the United Nations gives a roadmap, like the Sustainable Development Goals, which, unlike the Millennium Development Goals, are not the UN's, but the UN's gift to the world, just a roadmap that we can follow, those collaborations become the most meaningful thing we can do in terms of understanding the culture in crisis and also being able to be successful with inspiration. Those would be my ideas. Thank you, Connie.
Yeah,
Thank you,
Connie,
Patrick.
Connie, I was just going to add, just to buttress on Patrick's point. While we collaborate, it's important we also spell out the objective of our collaboration. So Patrick is 100% right to bring on board the issue of collaboration. So we could collaborate together to put forward policies that would foster our various agendas. We could collaborate on, for example, she was raising the issue of welfare for the people, for the children. We could collaborate to bring up policies that government can look into that would foster the welfare of children in that community. You could collaborate to bring about change in peace-related issues that relates to whatever the circumstance is in the particular country that you're working in. So that's just what I want to add to Patrick's point. Thank you.
Thank you, Ola. We have time for maybe one or two more questions, and then I am going to wrap up with our panel, and I'm going to invite the panelists to share one last tip or lesson learned on effective crisis communication and give their closing remarks. So each panelist will have about 2 minutes after we finish with the Q&A. I would like to call upon Rafael Lima from the Universal Esperanto Association to ask your question. Please turn on your video and unmute yourself to ask the question. Okay, I got a message that he can't do it right now. Howdy, I'll sing. Can you turn on your video and ask your question, please? Okay, I'm going to Divino Roberto Barissimo from OPA Brazil. Are you with us? Can you turn on your video and ask your question?
I have a question for Mr. Julia. I don't speak well in English, but I put the question in the chat. Please, it's possible to see my question in the chat?
Yes, the question is, let's say that hate speech is not just political or economic and social. We have a lexicon of hate in the world that needs a world auxiliary language to be reduced or eliminated. Is there UN thinking about this with Esperanto?
Okay, here's my question. Thank you.
Thank you very much for this question. I mean, multilingualism is definitely at the core of the UN's work and in recognition of the global mandate we have. I am not aware of any efforts being made particularly related to Esperanto. I know that when we marked the anniversary of the Universal Declaration for Human Rights, there was an effort to have that document translated into as many languages as possible. I'm sure Esperanto what was one of them, because the document now is the most, or the UDHR is the most translated document in the world as by the Guinness Book of World Records. But what I would encourage you, if you do have, again, just going back, and I know this is a very small slice of activities, you know, these assets that we do have, like I said, we have encouraged colleagues around the world and partners to translate them into their own languages of use. And perhaps that's something that you could think about in the Esperanto space as well, to enter that as a point when you talk about hate speech in particular, and connect with other civil society organizations. In that sense, I am, as I said, not aware of any particular efforts in Esperanto being done at the UN level. Thank you.
Thank you.
Okay. There is a question: how can we tell the social media news is true news or false news?
Thank you. That's my question. I represent the Hani Hakka Association of New York, and the question is, every day I see the news from Democratic and from Republican, always different stories. So how could we identify those news is true or it's a false? So that's a better question. Could we have like a certificate, message from NGO, like a certificate, and this is from our organization, so that we can see immediately that's true? And thank you. By the way, this is a great workshop. I like this efforts, and I like all the presentations. Thank you. Have a good day.
Does anyone want to answer that question in particular?
I don't know if Guy would like to. I could also offer a few thoughts.
Okay, I can offer a thought, but I think there's two questions here. The one is the individual ability to do critical thinking, to do research, to establish why you will trust one source of information rather than another source, to be aware of why sometimes you respond with emotion to some content rather than other content. Is it your heart that is affecting your ability to detect truth, or is it your head? These are all important questions, and this book that Patrick was commending, and again I commend the UNESCO book, it has a very good chapter called Fact Checking 101, which is a very good way to develop at the individual level your ability to do this, to distinguish what is true, what is false, and what is in the gray space between those, because some things are not purely true, not purely false. It's in contention, or the science is not there, or it's in the future. But having said that, this cannot be a question only of each individual being able to do all their own fact-checking, all their own research, all their own investigation of every single thing. I mean, that is just too much of a burden on each person. Now, we don't want people to become so cynical that they don't trust anything as a result of that, because they don't have capacity to check everything themselves. But here, what's so important are the social media companies. We see that some of them, they put some resources. Maybe somebody else can mute. There's somebody, if you can mute, thank you. Just to finish on this point, the social media companies that are distributing so much content, they do have some fact-checking capacity. They pay independent organizations to fact-check, but they do not do it in enough languages. They do not do it with enough people on the ground in the countries there. The fact-checking is not always then the results of the fact-checking on the content is not being labeled that according to the fact-checkers, this is the situation, although that is helpful. What they have started to do is to indicate what is the source of some content, if they think it's a government propaganda channel, or if it's an independent journalism channel. Those are good things that they can do. So these are very important things that the companies themselves, without making them the arbiters of truth, but to use some signals to empower people to think a little bit more carefully and to slow people down about what they might believe, what they may share, even sharing without reading it. And the last thing I would just say is that what is true and what is false is just part of the story, as I said before. It's also very important is what is the emotional content? And here, this is very different, because it is not a case that the social media should be labeling this is hate speech. This should not happen, because they should not even have hate speech on their platforms. I mean, this seems to me to be evident. Now, what is hate speech? How can people appeal if their content is being branded as hate speech, if it's being taken down or slowed down or demonetized? There needs to be very clear systems in the social media to deal with hate speech as distinct from this question of truth and falsity. And when these things are coming together, that's when the social media have got to understand these two elements, because hate speech, which incites to violence, hostility, and discrimination, can and should be prevented. And the social media companies, as businesses that have agreed to the Ruggie UN principles on business and human rights, they really have to take much more serious this question on hate speech, which is a slightly different question to the question of truth and falsity. Thank you.
Connie, can I weigh in for 1 sec?
Very briefly.
Yes, I think that it's when you see a news story on a social media platform, I think that's one way to get visibility for it. But then when you want to confirm whether it's true or not, you should go to a reliable, trusted news organization and see that if you can get a variety, just like any good reporter wants to have more than one source, if you can find more than one outlet that proclaims this particular bit of news, whether it's the New York Times or whether it's the BBC or whether it's Canadian broadcasting company, if you can get multiple sources from multiple countries to back that, I think that's a good way to divine whether something is true or not. The last thing to note is that, does the news organization that you're trusting print corrections? An organization that doesn't print corrections isn't necessarily a trustworthy organization. But if a newspaper or puts out a story, and then the New York Times has corrections every day, if you look, they're constantly updating the most minor infraction of the truth. And that is an organization that shows that it's trustworthy because they want to make sure that everything is correct. So that's one thing I would utilize as a resource to make sure that you're getting multiple sources of different media outlets and making sure that those media outlets correct themselves when they're wrong.
Thank you, Lance.
Thank you very much.
Should have a very direct answer, so I'm just going to ask it because I think it's relevant. Can the UN and which department play a role to intervene when hate speech from leaders of a country can pave the way to a genocide as one of the 8 points of genocide? Or is it expected to exhaust domestic avenues within that country first, or do both simultaneously? Is there someone that can answer that question very quickly? Go ahead,
I could
Julia.
speak to that. Thank you very much. I mean, as I had mentioned, the lead on this is indeed the Office of the Secretary General's Envoy on the Prevention of Genocide, and they have developed a framework of reference to sort of look at situations in countries and see which of the steps that might lead to real life violence or even to pre-genocidal or genocidal conditions are met. So this is something that this office is mandated with. They do, when their alarm bells are raised, there are missions that are being undertaken by the special advisor and by our office to look at situations on the ground, and where she then gathers information and and raises awareness of that, what the status is, what is happening, and what can be done by the international community, what work can be done together with internal agencies, with government. I mean, there's often it's not clear who is driving this, and of course this can come from government or part from internal sources. But I think one of the things that is really clear, and that has been shown through all the instances of genocides, that this is always a process. None of this ever happens overnight. People do not wake up and start slaughtering each other. This is really something that is systematic. There are the steps that lead to genocides. So there is a formula, there is a framework of reference, and the lead of that is the Office on the Prevention of Genocide. Of course, also the Office of the High Commissioner for Human Rights, Michelle Bachelet, currently in that function, also has a mandate on speaking out when this infringes on human rights principles. So those would be the two main offices in the UN working on that issue.
Thank you, Julia. Unfortunately, our questions and answers have to come to a close now because we're at the end of our program. I would now like to ask the panelists, and thank you very much to our panelists and to all our participants, but I would like to invite the panelists to share one last tip or lesson learned on effective crisis communication. And if you could keep your remarks brief to about a minute, we will be able to finish on time. So, Ola, would you like to start?
I didn't hear that, please, Connie.
Ola, if you would like to just wrap up and share one last tip or lesson learned on effective crisis communication to leave with our participants in 1 minute or less. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you very much once again, Connie. To be honest with you, it's really difficult to manage communication during crises. But you have to continue to speak to yourself. It's an inner language you need to speak to yourself, because when there's pandemonium everywhere, even when you have structures in place, when you have a culture of policies in place in your organization on what to do when this happens, everything gets mixed up. But you must always find a place of calmness within you to ensure, because if you get things wrong, you cannot coordinate your services and you cannot help others. And we NGOs are usually there to give a helping hand. So the only way we can do that is if we can put ourselves in check, and if we can be calm and collected, then we'll be able to, that would have a ripple effect on the services that we can offer to the people around us. So we need to do that. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Ola. Ratnamir, would you like to offer us final tips?
I mean, final tips now thinking of, because I've been in situation a few times with, you mentioned a lot of Bosnia and Herzegovina. So we had 4 wars there, then we had the massive crisis in Liberia, and then a couple of them here in South Sudan. So I think it's very important to have your sources and to know your sources, and you can trust them and you can rely on them. Then audiences are very important, and then channels of communications you're going to use. So for example, we are here in a situation that we cater mainly and especially is Radio Miraya for the local national audience in South Sudan, and we've been like this sort of the medium and the radio station with the widest coverage and reach in South Sudan. Then again, these two should lead to credible information. And again, I think it was Lance who mentioned that cooperation is very important. So keeping the communications channels open and coordinate and cooperate with your interlocutors and counterparts is very important. And again, as a radio station, we keep the channels open, so it's a two-way street. So one thing is like what we give to our audience, but then on the other hand, because our WhatsApp and telephone lines and everything is open, so they can feed into the program and provide the content from some areas where we don't have our reporters present. So maybe this would be in 50 seconds or so.
Thank you. I think that you've highlighted the importance of trust and having a trusted source of communication. And I think you have to work every day at building that trust with your communities to be effective in communication. So thank you so much. And Lance, would you like to give us final comments? And there's someone who's not on mute. Please.
Sounds like a tube station. I think I heard "Please mind the gap" there. First of all, I want to thank all my fellow speakers. Incredible comments from everyone. I want to thank GNEC for putting this together. I want to thank the UNDGC for just this great opportunity. And also want to thank the audience for the great questions. And also want to thank the Brooklyn Story Lab team for helping run the tech of this. Martha, thank you for all the great work you're doing. In terms of the last tip, journalists are often on the front lines of conflict. There's a committee called the Committee to Protect Journalists, to protect reporters and editors and people covering conflict because of the jeopardy that they put themselves into by being on the front lines. And Ratnamir, you're doing incredible work in South Sudan, and all of you, all the fellow panelists, but Guy also for putting this UNESCO book together. So journalists play an important role. And what we're saying, again, what Brooklyn Story Lab's position is that all of you are journalists. You're all civilian journalists. You all have the ability to report and tell the story about what the great work that you're doing on the front lines in the NGOs. Like Ola's been doing incredible work in Eastern Europe. You have the ability to tell that story. And it's really important that you do tell that story and share that story, because we need to hear it as the rest of the world. And so the last tip I have is just tell that story. Use your power, use your platform to put the story out there and to counter. The more truth you put out there, the more you're countering the fake news that the people who don't want to hear the truth will do their best to subvert it.
Thank you, Lance. Julia, would you like to offer final comments?
Yes, thank you very much. Very briefly, yes, I agree with all the points that have been raised. So I think when we look at crisis communication, we have to look at the longer term. Like we've said, you have to build community, you have to build trust within your own community, but also establish, I think, networks with trusted sources of information. So also you yourself, when you are caught in these situations where, like we've heard, it's chaotic, it is a crisis by definition, you also know where to draw information from that is reputable, that is truthful, and you can share with your community. And just on a very practical point, also from when we have our campaigns, yes, there is a crisis, but a lot of times crises are in the making. So plan, keep your fingers on the pulse, know what is coming up, and also prepare communications elements and assets. So when things do get chaotic, you already have information that you can share, pre-prepared content that can be adapted to a situation that will allow you to respond in a timely manner amidst the crisis situation. So that would just be sort of a practical point to convey, because information moves very quickly, and sometimes it's the fastest information that starts creating the narrative. So that is one point also to work forward-looking as much as you can in a crisis context.
Right. So to be able to plan ahead, have a plan in place that you can activate when you need it, and practice that ahead of time so that everyone knows where the trusted places are to go for that vital information. Thank you so much. And our final comments to come from Guy Berger.
Thank you, Connie. So I just want to repeat that you may not be a communicator or a professional communicator, but if you want to be seen, if you want to be on the scene, if you want to be standing out in the herd, you have to understand the jungle. And remember, there are hunters out there, and those hunters don't take kindly to whatever noise or visibility you may be having. So keep that in mind. I also want to join colleagues in thanking them and thanking all the participants for these great comments, and to say that I am now in the final hour of my service for the UN, because I retire very shortly. And it is with a great sense that I could participate in these last moments in this session, and to know that the UN and the NGO community are working together, because the ideals of both are so important for world peace. And the caliber and commitment and passion of people here, it gives me a really positive feeling when I wake up tomorrow and I'm no longer going to be in the UN. It's been a privilege to be at UNESCO for the past 10 years. And I do encourage everybody to keep up this cooperation between civil society and the different UN formations.
Congratulations.
So
Thank you.
Yes, thank
And
you so much.
congratulations. Good luck on the retirement.
you.
Thank you so much for being with us, Guy.
Yes,
Thank you, everyone.
thank you. So
Thank you so much, Guy.
it looks like we're out of time. I'd like to turn it over to Hawa if you have any concluding remarks. And please make use of the references and resources available to you on the DGC Civil Society Unit website. And I think that it's posted in the chat and it's also on the screen.
Well, thanks, Connie. What can I say? I've been planning this this event with everybody in the GNEC and DGC, but I was busy opening up the resources, really soaking in what everybody was saying. Some really great tips and resources, I think, which are good for everyone, not just civil society, but even we as UN staff members. Thank you so much, Julia. I mean, I was Googling up the hate speech, and I don't know what everybody thinks. I think we need a special session just on that. So Julia, we may be coming back to you. I've had a wonderful time, listening to everybody, really valuable insights, loved all the on the ground stuff that we were getting from Ratnamir and UNMISS. And I'm sorry we weren't able to take up all the questions, but we did as much as we could. And really applauding our great moderator, Connie, for really taking us through this really wonderful journey. I feel as myself, if I was a level 2 when I came here, I think I'm level 5+. And I owe that to the interaction and the great communication that we have had between all the speakers and the audience. I love the way the audience really was going at it in the chat, and that's a form of good communications also. Thank you, Patrick. Without you pushing us, we would not be where we are. Love the relationship we have with the GNEC and look forward to more collaboration. Guy, I keep saying, take me with you. I'm ready to go also. I don't know if you have a hand luggage in a suitcase, but I really appreciate, and on behalf of the team in DGC, I want to thank you for the wonderful collaboration we had also for World Press Freedom Day, which was just a couple of weeks ago. And then really, I know how busy you are to really take time to be with us today. I think it's a pleasure. It's a privilege. I hope that as you chart and champion your new journey, I'm sure there are lots of things you're going to do that you'll be fine if we can call upon you again sometime in the future to join us and to tell us what you've been up to. Ola, thank you so much. A great sister from the continent. I love the work that your organization is doing on the ground. Really, it's been a pleasure for me. And of course, how could I not thank the DGC team? We have such a great group of people. And, sometimes they say, how is not so easy to work with? I don't know what you think, but I'm so grateful to have such a, willing and such a really open, warm-hearted group of people that really works with us to bring the best to civil society, because this is it's sort of like our mantra, our bread and butter. It's our dream. It's what we are passionate about. And honestly, this is what keeps me engaged in the UN. So Guy, I may not just be ready yet, but keep me in mind. Thank you so much. And I'll pass it on to Patrick to finish the show. Over to you, Patrick.
Hey, I also wish to thank everyone. Thank you, Connie, so much for leading the way for us. Thank you so much for everyone to being part of this, either as a speaker or as a participant. Let me just remind you, someone asked, how can I quickly verify information? I think Lance pointed out, you really can't quickly. You have to think about this. Are you on a verified source? Someone once said that lies travel around the world before the truth wakes up and puts its shoes on. So you need to be really careful. And I think mostly we need to be careful about not following repeaters, but following reporters. Those who do the investigation that we all should do on the ground as NGOs needs to be followed by those we follow, and that we don't want to follow people who are just repeating others and think that they might have the truth. But those who are reporting are generally the ones who are on the ground doing the investigation first. So best of luck. It's a real challenge, but it's a great reward when it works well. Thank you all very much for being with us. We hope to see you at the next GNEC briefing. And until then, please visit us at gnec.ngo. Bye-bye, everyone.
Bye, everybody.
Bye, everyone. Thank you very much, Connie. Bye.